You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mock,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have one of my favorite authors back on the show. Melissa de la Cruz is here to talk about her brand new book. It's called Never After, the 13th Fairy, and this is the first in a brand new series called the Chronicles of Never After. And Melissa, I have to tell you, this is one of the most clever ideas for a book series that I've run across in quite a while, and I love where you're going with this. Welcome back to the show.
Oh, Hank, it's so nice to be here, and thank you so much for those kind words about the book. I'm so flattered. Yay!
You are so welcome. You know, there are certain people that you look forward to talking to because you know that that you're going to get to dig into their process a little bit and learn something. And I absolutely do that from you every time. But then there are people that you just enjoy talking to, and I'm super glad that you're back on the show today.
Oh, yay! I am too. Always fun.
Yeah, Melissa, when you were on the show a couple of times ago, we were talking about this book that you had that was a bit of a departure for you, in that it was more of a thriller. And then last time we talked about The Queen's Assassin, which had you kind of coming back to your fantasy roots. What is it? Do you remember what your first fantasy that you read that completely opened your imagination? It kind of that fantasy was something that you wanted to do for yourself.
Oh, I certainly remember it. And it was a book called The Lord of the Rings. And I remember I had tried to read The Hobbit maybe when I was around 11, and I just wasn't that interested in it. I remember kind of, putting it aside. It felt, even though it was it was the kids' book of the Lord of the Rings series, it was just a little too dense for me. I just wasn't into it at 11 years old. And then I picked up The Lord of the Rings when I was 13, and I got so into it. And it was the book that kind of opened up fantasy for me. I mean, I was a huge fan of Lord of the Rings, and it felt like it was my own personal fandom. When I was 13, I would write down in my notebooks that I was going to name my kids Legolas and Arwen. It couldn't happen, but it was I wanted at 13, and then I read the entire series, and then I reread The Hobbit, and I just got into fantasy. I just opened this whole world, even reading the Silmarillion. After you read Lord of the Rings, you read kind of the appendixes and indexes, and just the way that the story kind of, even keeps going in that way, where it's just, you're just reading like family trees and indexes. And I was just so into it. Absolutely.
Something that's fascinating to me is that I have, we've done more than 1,000 different shows now. And I've talked to authors of every stripe and that write in every genre that there is. And you would not believe the number of people that say that one of the first things that opened their imagination and made them want to be a writer was reading either Tolkien or C.S. Lewis with the Chronicles of Narnia. And there is such a common thread across all genres that root back to this book series. It's there's something magical about it.
Absolutely. And, I think it's because it's not just about fantasy. It's about friendship. It's about loyalty. And, there's certain moments in the book that would always make me cry, ever since I was 13, when Aragorn thinks Frodo was dead, because he's been stabbed by, one of the ring wraiths. and it turns out that Frodo is wearing that silver, kind of protective armor underneath his shirt that Bilbo gave him. And it's just the way that the character that Aragorn is just so relieved and so happy that his friend is still alive. And we learned that Tolkien, kind of based it on his experiences in war,
Right.
with a group of friends. And it's just, it's just so real, that moment, in a fantasy book.
Well, it's so weird because we're talking about sometimes even fictional races of characters with hobbits and elves and dwarves. Yet, I think the thing, like you rightfully put it, the thing that draws us is the human connection and the way we can explore real human emotion, even if it's through people that are not exactly human. Why do you think that we do we let our guards down more with fantasy literature, or what is it that allows us to tell very human stories, even if they're not necessarily human characters?
Yeah, I mean, my husband has a quote that he read. I can't remember who said it, but it was something like, "We like fantasy because the people are real and the situations, the environments are fantastical. But to make it work, the people have to be completely, real and relatable." And and he said, we don't people who like fantasy like that human element in this, kind of imaginative world. And then literature is, the people are kind of extraordinary and, a little bit more fantastical, but then the world is so ordinary. So I think we're drawn to these human stories, these real stories in this fantasy world because it's an allegory, it's a metaphor, it's not literal. And I also think it's a little escapist. In fantasy, the Dark Lord is slain,
Right.
triumphs over evil. It's so cozy and it just makes you happy, which I think is why I'm drawn to genre literature.
Absolutely. How many books does this make for you now that you've written?
I think it's around 63. I'm not sure if this is my 63rd book or if the books that I've published up till now is 63. But I know I did count this year, and this is around the 63rd book that I have.
I know a question that readers will have, and to a lot of writers, this may be kind of an old hat question, but do you ever struggle with new story ideas? With 63 books published, and we'll take the up or down there. But are you ever at a loss for new, fresh story ideas or new series ideas?
Not really. And I have a studio now with Disney, the Melissa Del Cruz studio, which basically is the ideas for books that I don't get to write myself. I like a lot of ideas. I like the culture. I like being part of it. I like trying to figure out, what is something that I can add to it. And I feel really lucky. But yeah, I think for writers, ideas are not the problem. It's the execution of them. Will I have time to do this? Is this something that I can sell? Is this something that readers will want to buy for me? Is this something I can convince my publisher to publish? But yeah, no, I think it's more trying to figure out which ideas, are the most, are the easiest to translate to a written book. Is this going to be something that I can carry through, in a whole novel or even in a whole series of novels? So, some ideas really just are maybe just a short story or maybe just, a little anecdote, like people, I think people who aren't novelists or aren't long story writers, they'll say, "Oh, you should write about that," or "Oh, that's fine," and then I'll just be like, because I can always tell them, and I think another writer told me, just tell them, that's just an anecdote. That's not enough for a whole novel.
Oh, that's hilarious. Well, speaking of your new partnership with Disney, I know that you have done things with them in the past, with the Descendants, and various things. What are they like to work with, as far as storytellers? As kids that grew up with Disney, as I did, Disney was kind of the cornerstone of storytelling in a lot of ways, especially our childhoods. What are they as a company like to work with?
They're really great to work with. I've worked with Disney now for almost 20 years. I think they're very collaborative. I think when they bring on talent, when they asked me to do Descendants, they kind of gave me, the keys to the kingdom. It's like anything I wanted to do story-wise was kind of open. They were kind of open to my ideas on how to bridge the original classic movies to the new Disney Channel movie. And what I found was interesting was their attention to detail. These are the stories that are part of their franchise, that are part of what makes Disney Disney. So there's certain things that they were protective about, which was never, what I was worried about. Like, oh, can I do this thing? Can they go to a secret island and find this? And there's an apple in the tree. And they're like, yeah, that's fine. Something completely outrageous, never been done before. They were fine with that. What they were protective about was stuff like, I remember when I wrote in one of the Descendants books, that there were fairies whose mom was Tinkerbell. And they were like, Tinkerbell does not have any descendants. Certain characters, no. You can't mess with Tinkerbell. But did Tinkerbell have a sister who might have had some, descendants? Yeah, that's fine. But just not Tinkerbell herself.
That's so funny. And they are very protective of the story and kind of the big ideas around their characters, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. And, that was even with how Maleficent was depicted. We couldn't really stray that far from, kind of her iconic characterization in the original Sleeping Beauty movie. She is this big, bad, evil, iconic villain. And we couldn't, we didn't really want to mess with that too much.
Gotcha. Well, I know that Rick Riordan has an imprint with Disney now with the Rick Riordan Presents and allowing other voices to tell stories like his, and the way that he, merges, different legends and myths in from different parts of the world with, a modern flair or a modern adventure story. Are you doing something like that with them where this is kind of stories that you approve of and have your stamp on, or what's that partnership like for you?
No, my deal is a bit different because it is creating intellectual property for Disney. So all of the books come from my ideas. So it always starts with me. And then we try to find a writer who can collaborate with us and kind of bring that book to life. But they are my books. They are my ideas. So it's a little bit different from Rick's imprint.
Gotcha. Jackson's battle to take control over his own mind and life portrays what millions of people are fighting with around the world: mental illness. His mother, desperate to free him from his demons and desperation, faces her own turmoil and anguish, doing anything possible to save her son through love and hope. After countless emotional and heartbreaking triumphant moments, June and her son must both accept that only Jackson can save himself. Pick up Jackson by Lynn Mclaughlin and discover why people are raving about this book and saying things like, Jackson is symbolic of millions living with some form of mental illness, and his mother represents the millions who have their own struggles caring for someone
with a mental health issue. Jackson by Lynn Mclaughlin. Pick it up today at Amazon.com. Both Barrels Publishing is the brainchild of successful indie author James P. Sumner. He has self-published over 15 titles in the last 5 years and has over 800,000 downloads so far in his career, meaning he has a wealth of knowledge and experience to share with the indie publishing community. Knowing the struggles of the modern-day indie author as well as he does, he wanted to create a platform that would allow writers of any level to learn the ropes, navigate the pitfalls, and produce a professional novel without wasting time or money in the process. Both Barrels Publishing is the perfect one-stop shop for any indie author, combining James's expertise with his own team of editors and designers so you can help your novel realize its full potential and learn how to publish yourself. The purpose of Both Barrels Publishing is to help indie authors get their novels ready for publication without all the stress, hassle, and unnecessary expense. We want to make your lives easier, which is why we're giving you access to a top-notch team to publish your novels, along with a generous discount on their services. You can also work one-on-one with James to learn the intricacies of self-publishing. No hidden cost, no false promises. We simply want you to publish the best version of your novel. BothBarrelsPublishing.com.
So let's talk about the new series that the 13th Fairy, the Never After. What was the beginning idea for this series for you?
It was funny. It came from an idea I'd been working with for a while, and it was a really different idea that ended up being Never After. So I think around by the time the Game of Thrones TV show was kind of ending, I saw a photograph in a magazine of the actors who played Jon Snow and Ygritte, who were romantically involved on the show, the characters, and in the books. This is Jon Snow's great love of his life, Ygritte, and in the story, in the books and in the TV show, Ygritte dies. It was very sad.
Right.
I saw this photograph of the actors, and the actors who played Jon Snow and Ygritte were getting married. And I was just filled with this happiness to see them married. And I thought, oh my God, in a parallel universe, Jon Snow and Ygritte are totally fine and they're married. And I just so kind of delighted by this thought that these characters had this other life, these actors, and some kind of, happily ever after for them somehow. Maybe not in the Game of Thrones world, but in our real world. And so I thought, wouldn't it be fun to do a book that kind of had that, where, these characters that are so beloved have this tragic ending in the fantasy world, but in this parallel universe, the actors who play them, romance that works. So I was with this idea, and I'd written a couple proposals trying to figure out how to bring this book to life. And it didn't quite work out as a young adult. And so, but I still kind of had the seed of this idea of kind of conflating the real world and fantasy. And then it became the idea of what if a super fan of a fantasy series ended up in the fantasy world? So I had that. and then I thought, I feel like now it has to be a middle grade book. And I was doing a little research. I thought maybe I still want to do fairy tales. And I discovered that the original Grimm's fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty doesn't actually end with the prince waking up Sleeping Beauty with true love's kiss. They get married, but then his mother-in-law his mother is an ogre. She tries to kill Sleeping Beauty, kills children. I mean,
Plot twist.
Yeah, frames the prince for it. I mean, it's just this whole tragic, horrible, sad fairy tale ending. And I thought, oh my God, what if the evil fairy, when she cursed Sleeping Beauty, wasn't actually cursing her? She was trying to save her from this terrible fate. And that's kind of when the story kind of clicked in. And I thought, oh, great, I can have my super fan of this fantasy series, which I'm calling in the book also the Never After series. And, this girl suddenly discovers that the 13th book is not being published. And then instead of reading the 13th book, discovers that she's part of it. So that's kind of the long history of that idea.
you said that you started writing a proposal for what you thought might be a young adult novel or series, and it didn't work out. Is this something that you do when you're thinking of a new series? Do you start working out the proposal and seeing what it might look like? Is there a part of kind of pre-writing or planning that goes into it to let you know whether this is something feasible or not?
Yeah, I started working on it. Usually I propose books. I write a proposal, kind of telling the editors what it would be, a little synopsis. And, in this case, it was just, it just didn't work out as a YA book. And I can't remember whether it was like certain logistics with my contracts where I was already beholden to something else, or, I don't really remember. Or I kind of thought maybe it was a little thin, like it was really just that moment of picking actors, and that's why I'm like, well, maybe that wasn't quite a big enough idea for a whole series and a whole novel. But yeah, I do, start to write it out, and then, I'll send it to my agent, see what he thinks, send it to the editors, see what they think. And, no matter what, even though I've had 63 books published, some of the proposals, they're just not as into. They'll be like, yeah, try again. Like we don't see that, really selling, or, we'd like something different from you. I mean, publishing is a business. It's
right.
It's not just a dream factory.
Well, and I would imagine that over 63 books that you've developed a bit of a professional relationship with your work in a way that you can separate your feelings about the story from whether from being able to tell, is this really going to work or not? How do you maintain that space between you and the work while still obviously caring so deeply about the work because it shows on the page? Like, how do you connect with your work while also staying objective about it?
Well, I think, I think that's really important for writers to do. I don't think your identity can be wrapped up in the work. And I think I discovered that it's actually something that you discover not in failure, but in success. Because I think the first time I had a major hit in my hands, which was because the Au Pairs did quite well. It was a huge seller, but it was really Blue Bloods that kind of became a little bit of, a life changer in that, I'll just state it plainly. When you're a mid-list writer, you maybe hear from your agent a couple of times a year.
Sure.
You hear from your editor also a couple of times a year. It's a little bit more. There's not as many meetings. There's not as much to weigh in on. And then suddenly, when Blue Bloods took off, we were just on the phone every week, and there was all this like strategy about the next book in the series and how we would launch it. And, they would call you every week with an update on sales. And I was like, oh, wow, this is like a whole different level.
Right.
And it was interesting to kind of like experience, a publishing career in kind of this gradual way. It was kind of nice. I'd been kind of tootling around for a while. My book sold all right, sold well. I always had books under contract, but then suddenly, and then you start to believe your own press, you get this huge head. And that's when, as my husband said, you were really kind of awful at that stage. And I think what happened for me is that in 2008, we were going to have a TV show for Blue Bloods. There were all these meetings. There was so much hoopla. And I was starting to believe in it. And then all of a sudden it died. The TV show didn't get picked up. Everybody says, oh, is this going to happen? This is going to happen. And it was my first kind of brush with Hollywood that way. And then when it didn't happen, I was like, oh my God, Hollywood lied. and it just like all the air came out of my big balloon head. And I think ever since then, I've been able to kind of really kind of separate, my emotions from how the book is doing, which I think, you kind of have to do. Otherwise, you're going to go insane. So while I really, am passionate about the work and I'm, 100% serious about my work, you can't control the reaction to it. So
Right.
you can't control whether people are going to like it or not, whether it's going to be a hit or not. You can try to, write the best book you can, and then you just have to see what happens, and sometimes it's just timing, and it's just, sometimes it's just luck. And, I remember when I pitched the Alex and Eliza book to my editor, she said, "This is great, but we need it now." She kind of said, for this book to really take off, would have to publish in 6 months. Can you do that? Which meant a really crazy writing schedule and getting everything together in such a short period. And I said, okay, let's do it. And it was like kismet. Like, she called it. She's like, we can't wait a year. Like, it has to come out in 6 months. Otherwise the moment will pass. And it was published just at the perfect time. So sometimes that happens, and it's great, and we're, and you get really lucky. But again, you can't let it get to your head. You can't rest on your laurels too much.
Well, I think there's this sort of silly misnomer, especially amongst new writers, that people get so caught up in especially one of their first novels, and they feel like they're putting all of them into the book, and this thing has to be absolutely perfect, and that it sort of consumes their life, and like they're working on their magnum opus. And as someone that has 63 books in her back catalog, you obviously take very special care in everything that you write, and it shows. And your fans that follow you see that care that goes into them. But obviously, at some point, you have to understand that there's not one single work that's going to define you as a writer. Is that something that you ever wrestled with?
Not really. I think, I always wanted to be able to have a commercial career in publishing. My heroes were Stephen King, who's written, I don't know, even more, 100 books, let's say. I mean, I read
Sure.
pretty much all the Stephen King books when I was 13, all his back catalog from the 70s up to what he was publishing when I was a high school senior in 1989. So, probably 20 years of his books I read. And then my other hero was a kid's book writer, Enid Blyton, who wrote 500 books, So I really liked that kind of lifestyle. I wanted to write a lot of books. I wanted to be somebody who only wrote books, who had writing books as, their source of income. I didn't want to do anything else. I didn't want to teach. I didn't want to be a journalist. I didn't want to have a day job. I wanted to write books like Stephen King and Enid Blyton. So yeah, I would say I don't have a singular book that really defines me, and I'm fine with that.
I love that answer. In the Never After series, there's something that it's kind of a guilty pleasure to read books about books, and to have a character that transcends and becomes part of the story is kind of delicious for book lovers. Tell me a little bit about Filomena. Who is she, and why does this thing happen to her?
So Philomena, is a little bit of me when I was 12, as like a big fan, a big stan of books, of a book series. So she's a little bit of, 12-year-old me into Lord of the Rings, into Dune, having these books as kind of her best friends. She's not doing too well in school socially. She's being bullied. Her best friends has dumped her, which happened to me at that age. I remember that. How hurtful it was. And she's a little bit of my kid. She's a little sassy. I wanted to write about a modern kid, and I had one right here. She's a little inspired by my child, who thinks we're too overprotective. The parents in it are definitely me and my husband. And there's a little bit of poking fun at having, kind of neglectful writer parents who are always on deadline. Also super overprotective. She's not allowed to do a lot of things, but her parents are so happy when she's reading.
Right.
Yeah. So I wanted to write about, a real kid today. Somebody who was a super fan of books, a little bit of nerdy. I love bookwormy kids, and seeing myself in books too, in Joe March, in all these kids, in Hermione. It's kind of like a tribute to bookish kids everywhere who go on adventures in their mind.
And she's fascinated by the series called Never After. And what's the mechanism that opens this world to her?
So she goes to get the 13th book and discovers it's not there, and she sees other fans, from the books, and it turns out that one of these people that she thinks are her fellow fans are actually characters from the book, and they've kind of stumbled into this world because they're looking for something. And then she kind of joins them on this adventure, which takes place through a tree portal, even though they say that chimneys and wardrobes are kind of good ways to get to other places. In my world, it's the tree.
Melissa, when you had kind of stumbled onto the mechanism of the story, she's going to inhabit fairy tales. When you kind of got to that point, and you said like, this is kind of this aha moment that happens a lot of times when you think of something like that. Did you start thinking of different fairy tales that you could then bring into the story? Like, how did you choose what was going to make up the series then?
Yeah, I think I just chose stories that I knew a little, knew well. And I think that I don't want to spoil it, but one of the characters turns out to be, somebody from a fairy tale with a lamp in front of it. And I thought that was really fun because his name, kind of aligned with the character. And I just thought, that'd be kind of fun. That's a fun puzzle. And I always like, Red Riding Hood and the Wolf. I like to twist things around, so I would try to find these stories that had this one, everybody knew about, let's say, Scheherazade, who had to tell the emperor 1,001 stories, otherwise he was going to kill her. And then in my book, she's like, oh no, he would never do that. Like she's kind of, she was like, it was just about, the girls losing face, because he didn't pick them. So we had to say that, he was killing them because otherwise they would be killed. So, it's just kind of fun to like twist things that we know.
Love it. Well, I know that there's a second book that's coming, and it's going to be called The Stolen Slipper, I believe. Do you have a vision for the full series? Do you know where this is going?
Yes, I do. And I kind of had to figure it out because I was not only writing book 2, but also trying to plan out book 3. And, it is hard to plan these things because you never know when the publisher will stop publishing them. I was very lucky, with Blue Bloods, we published 7 of the novels, but I actually think we were going to publish 9. But then, the story and, just the way it was working out, I said, I don't think I want to stretch it that far. I think I have to wrap it up now with book 7. And they were happy with that too. But, they bought 2 at a time. So I was like, how did I know I could still write these? 'Cause I kept going. I knew what the end was, but I didn't know exactly what book would take me there, But I think around book 6, when I was planning book 6 and 7, we were like, I think we should wrap at book 7, and they were fine with that. But now we're having a new Blue Bloods book, which is kind of funny because now we are publishing 2 more Blue Bloods books, which would bring the tally to 9, which was what they had bought. So that's kind of funny. Just realized.
Well, speaking of more Blue Bloods books coming, you write very varied subject matter and age groups. Does kind of moving from one to the other, does that keep the writing fresh for you and prevent you from feeling like this is territory I've trodden already?
Yeah. I think how I deal with writer's block is I have a lot of projects. So when I get stuck on project, I just work on the other one, which is great because it keeps me engaged and working. And then when I'm kind of, loose, then I can go back to the project that was giving me trouble. So I think that's been kind of good for me. Yeah, it's hard to write one, genre after the other. Like if I've written like a YA fantasy, I want to write something else. If I'm in the middle of writing my middle grade, I don't want to write another middle grade. I want to write, maybe an adult thriller again, So I do try to not do the same thing one after the other. Like after I wrote Never After, I wrote another. I went to jump to my next project, and then now I'm back on Never After. But I didn't write the sequel immediately after writing the first book. I had to take, some time from it.
Love it. Well, the new book is Never After, the 13th Fairy, the first book in the Chronicles of Never After series. Melissa, I love this book. I love what you're doing with it. Can't wait to see where you take us on this journey. We're going to put links to it in the show notes of this episode where people can grab the hardcover or Kindle edition or audio book. I love that you're doing audio of these, by the way. But where can people find you if they want to dig into all of the great stuff that you do?
Oh, great. Melissa-delacruz.com is my website. And on Twitter, I'm Melissa Delacruz, one word. And on Instagram, author Melissa Delacruz.
Excellent. We'll put links to all of those places in there where people can find you. Melissa, this is always so much fun to chat and get to catch up. Thank you for taking time to come back on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Hank. It's always a pleasure to chat with you.
A hitman with a conscience. Ian Bragg is paid to kill people. Only bad people and not many, but for a great deal of money. Case the target. Make the hit. Move on. Until he meets the woman with sparkling green eyes who changes everything. A few pre-readers had this to say about Ian Bragg. Mark Dawson, million-selling thriller author, says a rip-roaring ride from start to breathless finish. Craig Martell hit a home run with The Operator. The taut, lean prose and lightning-fast pace make this a page-turner without sacrificing an ounce of story or depth. You'll find yourself rooting for the hitman main character as he faces the toughest decision of his career. The Operator is the start of a new thriller series I expect to see burning up bestseller list for years to come, says A.C. Fuller, author of The Crime Beat and Alex Vane media thrillers. Suave, romantic, and lethal, Ian Bragg is everything you want in a highly paid assassin. Can't wait to ride this train, says James Blatch, self-publishing formula. It's been a long time since I fell this hard in love with a book, a very long time. Author of Women of Wine County romantic suspense Terry Wells Brown says. Grab this book from Craig Martell, The Operator. Bone Thief, John Driscoll, Book 1 by Thomas O'Callaghan. A sociopathic killer is using the internet to lure seemingly random women to their gruesome deaths in New York City. During his heinous murder spree, this madman is extracting the bones of his victims. His sheer brutality has the residents of the Big Apple in panic mode. Who is this twisted psycho who's abducted a housewife in broad daylight only to dispose of her lifeless body alongside a lake in Prospect Park, nailed the boneless remains of a nameless drifter to the underside of a boardwalk at Rockaway Beach, allowed the gutted corpse of a single parent to wash ashore under the Brooklyn Bridge, and has had the audacity to leave the desecrated body of the Magnolia Tea heiress rotting atop trash at one of the city's sanitation dumps. NYPD's top cop, Homicide Commander John W. Driscoll, has never witnessed such savagery. Hammered daily by the district attorney, the mayor, and the police commissioner, the lieutenant, who's battling his own inner demons, must use every resource available to put an end to the killings. In a race against time, Driscoll, aided by Sergeant Allegante and Detective Cedric Tomlinson, sets out on a roller coaster of an investigation to first identify the villainous fiend and then put an end to his butchering. Grab Bone Thief by Thomas O'Callahan now.